Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference titled Whole House Gassing with CO2 for Poultry Farms. Please note that all participant lines will be muted. Until the Q&A portion of the presentation, we will provide you with instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that point of time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. Please select the Participants menu at the top of your screen and opt to Send Note to all presenters. If you're logged in using the web-based application, please use the Notes tab on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and address your questions to all moderators. With that, I'll turn the call over to Elizabeth Clark. Liz, please go ahead.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Clark, and I'm a training specialist with the Professional Development Services Branch staff. I also would like to thank you for joining us today for this great webinar. Our speaker today is Dr. Scott Udalshees, and Scott has served as the Emergency Coordinator in California, Hawaii, Pacific Territories with USDA, APHIS, Veterinary Services since 2005. He's worked to develop the animal health infrastructure to effectively respond to animal emergencies while actively leading the management of the responses to eradicate and control disease outbreaks, identify and respond to emerging issues with collaborators, while developing staff and shareholders to achieve core competencies. Most recently, he has worked with the National Veterinary Stockpile, VS Depopulation Leads, private industry, and 3D contractors to develop the capability to deploy whole house gassing with CO2 for emergency depop of poultry houses, which of course is the topic for today's webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Well, thank you, Liz, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for their attention today. I'm going to give you a lot of information today about the development and the process, and then some steps forward with it. I guess I'll start with, why did we start thinking about developing this capability for the USDA and animal health authorities? Well, back in 2014, 2015, a gap was identified during the HPAI outbreak in the Midwest egg production facilities. We didn't really have a good way to get to these large production facilities of 400,000 cubic feet plus and effectively depopulate them and decrease the virus production and spread. Because of the delay of the depopulation and disposal, potentially for weeks and months, the virus could have easily spread to other adjacent prems or other farms or in the area. So the need was identified. I had the opportunity to go work at Canadian Food Inspection Agency on their first outbreak in the Fraser River Valley out from Vancouver, and I noticed that they used this whole house gassing in some cases, but when I looked at their houses, we could fit 4 or 5 of their houses in one of our production houses. So the scale of production in Canada versus the United States was completely different, but the principles were very similar, and we were able to partner with people to try to solve that problem and develop a method and the materials to accomplish the objective. So my next slide talks about the proof of concept test that the National Veterinary Stockpile conducted. We first started in November of 2015. We had the opportunity to go into some layer houses in northern Iowa that had been infected in the previous outbreak, and they were just fallow. So we had several different styles to look at, the Enriched style as well as the old pit style. They were fallow, but we had sentinel birds at different levels in the barn. And we started learning about how to not only reach the concentration to meet euthanasia, but also the protocols to keep our people and personnel safe during the process. We learned a lot on that. It was encouraging, but then the questions came up, well, could we also utilize this in flat barns? We had the opportunity in the spring of 2016 to go out to Colorado, had access to 4 or 5 breeder broiler curtain-sided barns, and worked with the same deal. These were not completely full production barns, but they had production birds in them. So they weren't the highest stocking density, but it was a very real situation. We learned a lot from that, but one of the things that take homes with that is that our units were kind of bulky. They were difficult to clean and disinfect. They were difficult to transport in our trailers, and they were difficult to move where we wanted them to move inside the barns because of the way they're constructed. So we went through a different fabrication process of second generation and had newly fabricated units that addressed all those concerns of easy to transport, easy to break down, and place in different configurations in poultry production houses, no matter what the production type, and then also work to improve the ability to clean and disinfect those units. We were able to go test these units in Minnesota in a full production layer facility and had tremendous success. And one of the outcomes of that, too, was that was the first time we were presented with the challenge of removing over 100,000 freshly euthanized birds in a very effective and efficient manner. And so we worked on the metric that I'll share with you a little bit later on what that took to pull that off for our future planning. And lastly, the question came up in March of 2017. We had the opportunity to try the methods on turkey production, curtain-sided barns in Missouri. They presented its own challenges because this was a fallow site that the curtains were in disrepair. There were holes. There was, it was very ventilated. And so we developed some best practices through that experience as well. We were able to meet concentration, but because of some of the disrepair of the barns, and we didn't take the extra time, we did get some surprises that we then learned from and then developed best practices to utilize in full production barns. And I'll share that with you as we go through the presentation. So where we are now with the National Breeding Stockpile capabilities, we've proved the proof of concept. That was completed. We know that we can utilize this technology in egg laying facilities as well as chicken or turkey flat barns. The NVS has a log pack with all of the materials needed to gas, seal, vent, and C&D the equipment. There's a developed standard operating procedure written. We have a CO2 gassing checklist, and then, of course, a PowerPoint presentation utilizing or describing all of the process. The National Veterinary Stockpile then went into an expansion phase, had 12 of these units fabricated, and now they're currently deployed and cached in high poultry dense areas throughout the country. They're deployable assets now and can be ordered during an animal disease emergency via the NVS 2013 resource request form. That's coordinated by the NVS logistics chief, and the units and supplies are shipped in utility trailers and include 3D contractor support, materials, and equipment for the successful execution of CO2 gassing operations. I will add at this point, too, that if you're ordering the assets to come, a trained veterinary services depopulation lead will also be deployed to be on site to manage that depopulation using these resources. The slide just illustrates the NVS Secure website. If you're not aware of this, you can get access to it and see all the NVS assets and their configurations, what they look like. There's photographs, there's lists of all the materials, and in this you will see everything that's in the log pack that's packed in these trailers and the configuration. And then, of course, you can get access to the 2013 unique to NVS. Here's what they look like. This slide illustrates the trailers, self-enclosed trailers, the materials packed in there, and there's a packing list also included. Basically, when you get into the cold zone, you start unpacking, or the warm zone, unpacking the trailers, and just take what you need into the hot zone to set up inside the house. So the next slide really just illustrates what one unit looks like. One unit consists of one CO2 tanker. That's a 20-ton liquid CO2 tanker with a high pressure line plus a vapor line. A distribution box is included, which is really just like a distribution manifold. And then we have 4 dosing manifolds with many 50-foot hoses to accommodate how far we want to put the units inside the production house. The unit also consists of all the monitoring devices for CO2 or oxygen, and then the polyethylene tubing that we place inside the house and then run outside the house to monitor from a safe distance. It includes calibration station and gas cylinders for the monitors, as well as all the sealing and venting materials and equipment. So here's what the units look like when they're broken out. Looking at the photograph from your left, you'll see the the distribution box or the distribution manifold. You'll see a high pressure line and a vapor line coming out on the left, and then 4 ports going out on the right. The hoses are connected to those 4 ports, and then those are connected to the dosing manifolds that are on the middle and the right side of the screen. The new fabrication is on these pyramid shaped like car jacks, where you can easily just clamp the dosing manifolds on top at whatever angle or configuration you want, depending upon how wide of an alleyway or situation you have, or if you want to change the direction of the vapor flow away from an infrastructure, or say birds, you want to direct the vapor flow away where birds are. So this next slide just illustrates some of the things you consider before you arrive on site. Number one, the type of barn. You know, is it curtain-sided? Is it a solid-sided egg production facility? And then what's the estimate for the volume? If we know the volume, we can estimate about how many pounds of liquid CO2 will be needed to euthanize that house, and then that'll give you a metric for how many tankers you might need on a large complex. The formula is pretty simple. Once you have the volume or cubic feet, you divide by 8.9, and that will give you an estimate of the number of pounds. It's not an exact, but there's some variables that can change that, but it gives you a good working metric. Species is a consideration. Need to hold the CO2 at concentration longer in turkeys than in chickens. Sealing considerations. Do you need extra poly sealing curtain-sided houses outside the house or inside the house? Do you need to get the company or our local responders to start sealing that house up so that just when the NVS contractors get there and the depopulation leaves, they can immediately start putting the units in the house and start setting up for gassing. We need to be able to get that tanker within about 20 feet of either the side of the house or the ends. Considerations for the belts, water pipes, flash freezing, considerations to mitigate. I haven't had any infrastructure damage in any of the tests, training, demonstrations, trials that I've done, but I always prepare for that. So if there's an egg belt or manure belt, we loosen the tension on that, because if it gets cold in the house, belts can contract and they can cause damage to the infrastructure. Water pipes, we don't have to completely drain them, but we need to bleed them off so that there is flash freezing. If there's expansion of ice in the lines, it won't break the lines. There's room for it to expand. So we bleed off as much water as we can, but they don't have to be empty. And then flash freezing, sometimes we use insulation, foam boards. We direct the vapor away from anything that we might think could be damaged by cold just for a short period of time. We plan for where we're going to put our CO2 and O2 monitoring devices or tubes. We also plan for ventilation as as CO2 comes into a house. There's air that is displaced by that gas, and that air has to go somewhere. We like for it to go up to the top part of the house and out. So we leave some venting. for that to occur. Also, safety concerns, identify any falling, adjacent residences that may be affected by either the off-gassing or the vapor down the wind, or just keeping track of where those residents are during the gassing procedures. Leakage to adjacent buildings. For instance, you may have crosswalks, you may have egg belts in large production facilities. There could be CO2 bleeding into an adjacent building that you're not actively gassing. We do multiple roll calls, a buddy system, and keep tabs of any other crews on the premises that might be doing like work to the infrastructure on another house, or like say working on electricity or gas line. Also, can birds be compressed in a flat barn to facilitate disposal or removal? You know, we do that a lot of times with foaming process, move the birds to a smaller area if they can be driven. And there's some advantages to do that in using the whole house gassing. Less gas is used, but it also facilitates disposal and removal of those birds. Classic example is breeder-broiler birds. We try to get them in the middle of the house, put down netting so that we're not removing euthanized birds from the nesting boxes. And then lastly, we talked about ventilation options. It's best to vent from the outside. We don't seal things from the inside. We put the poly, we put things on outside the doors on the outside so that the crews can pull that off on the outside and then hopefully turn on the ventilation fans remotely, or just enter for a short period of time to turn on a switch or a breaker. So quickly, here's the whole process. When we talk about mobilizing, if we have notification that there is a disease event, it's important to mobilize on that presumptive positive. We're all aware and sensitive to the 24-hour goal. The only way that will happen is if we mobilize the units and the CO2 tankers and the depopulation lead on that presumptive positive, so they all show up within that 24-hour period and then start initiating the depopulation on the affected houses. If we wait too late for this confirmation, then we're already behind the 8 ball. So I can't emphasize that enough. The next circle, we assess the house, we seal the house. That should be already starting before we arrive with the units. When the crews arrive, we place the manifolds, seal the doors, fans, do our safety procedures, safety checks, roll calls. We start rolling the gas. Initially, we're trying to get a 20% concentration in the barn. Once that happens, the birds are unconscious. So the vocalizations, peeps, wing flutters, all that usually stops when we reach 20%, and that takes somewhere between 20 to 25 minutes. We're shooting for a 40-45% concentration of CO2 inside the house at the highest level of birds. At that time, those birds are considered successfully depopulated or euthanized, and we hold that for up to 20 minutes, particularly in the turkey production houses. The next stage is visiting the barns, basically uncovering the fans, pulling the poly off, the doors, actively ventilating by turning on fans. If necessary, it only takes 3 or 4 fans in each house. You don't need to turn on all the fans to vent the house. And then, of course, demobilizing equipment, setting it up in an adjacent barn, or cleaning it, disinfecting, initiating disposal of the birds, and then moving on to a different parameter back to the warehouse. So that completes the cycle. Let's get down to it, and let me show you a couple of pictures of what it actually looks like. So this is a photograph of an actual 20-ton CO2 tanker. It's got a high-pressure line that the technician's working on right there. There's basically 2 major suppliers in the United States, Praxair and Air Gas, and then they provide a lot of local distributors. Each of these companies has production sites and distribution sites throughout the country. The amount of CO2 and the number of tankers can fluctuate throughout the year, as CO2 is a byproduct of fertilizer and the petroleum production. So different companies have strengths in different geographic regions of the country, and so the supply is always moving. Our emergency needs are emergency needs. These are, they basically service the industries they normally service, but we're developing a relationship with them to service us in the case of a poultry emergency. So here's a couple of houses of egg-laying barns. You guys have never seen these, or if you have, it'll probably bring back some memories for you. The house on the left is a conventional barn. It's a pit style. The little door at the bottom goes directly into the pit, and that's where the manure is. The roll-up door up high, that's where all the birds are in the kind of the cage batteries that you're used to stack cages with walkways in between the different rows of cages. The Enriched barn on the right, that barn's actually divided longitudinally through the middle. Now, there's a separate population on the left than on the right. But if you look at the volume of these barns, they're, 480,000 cubic feet, 640,000 cubic feet, 150,000 birds to 200,000 birds in the house. But you can see the amount of CO2 that will be estimated to be needed to reach concentration in each of these setups. Those are just estimates based on the calculation of the 8.9. So here's what it looks like. When we bring the units in, we bring in these large egg-laying facilities. We bring in a tanker from each end of the house. You can see that by the orange tanker. The green box is the distribution box, and then it has 4 lines, hoses coming off of that from the ports to the dosing manifolds that are set up at the ends of each of the rows of birds. You can see that we have high and low CO2 and O2 monitoring devices at the highest position in the birds. We place those about a foot higher than the highest bird, and then a reading at the lowest bird. And we do that at each end and at the middle of the house. Here's the high pressure line coming from the tanker. Even though there's 20 tons of liquid CO2, only about 38,000 pounds of that is usable CO2. You can see the vapor line and the liquid line coming in from the right. This is the distribution box being charged up, and then you can see the dosing lines leaving the ports going into the house through the roll-up door. To the dosing manifolds, and this was the old style first generation dosing manifolds that we had set up on the landing at the end of the production barn. The newly fabricated units are the ones that are on the pyramid type stands. We can tilt them to go down more narrow alleyways. They're easier to maneuver and to prevent any kind of vapor spray on any birds that are in production on that lowest tier. We were able to put foam boards and mitigate that. These units can be put together just with a couple of wrenches. It's very easy. Always have to have duct tape. And then these slides illustrate the crews, setup crews, just placing the polyethylene tubing at the high and low positions throughout the barn to monitor the CO2 and O2 concentrations as we're gassing. So this next slide really just illustrates kind of the gassing protocol. We clear the building, make sure no one's still left inside. Depopulation lead does a safety roll call. We have that verified by 2 people. We have a communication check with radios. We have our monitoring in place at high and low and middle. The depopulation lead will signal for CO2 vapor to charge the system and on both ends of the house simultaneously. And then once the system is charged with vapor, to blow out the system and reach pressure, then we change to liquid CO2. It's open at full flow rate until it reaches about 30% concentration. At that time, we know the birds are unconscious, and then we decrease the flow rate to about half to decrease the turbulence of the CO2 vapor inside the house. At that time, we just kind of see a bathtub effect of the CO2 then kind of rising up until it reaches 38 to 40%. We turn off the CO2, but we found that it keeps climbing up to about 45%. And we hold that up to 20 minutes. Usually about 10 minutes is adequate for caged birds, but 20 minutes just to be sure, or in turkeys. But we also monitor that O2 to make sure it drops down to the single digits, because we found that's a good indicator of complete euthanasia throughout the house. We have noticed that temperature, there's been flash low points right around the dosing manifolds that approach 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the average temperature throughout the house, away from the dosing manifolds, stays about a constant 65 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And some of the production facilities, I have put 2 oscillating fans down in the low portion of the house, or the pit, because CO2 is heavier in air. The concentration will be higher down there. I just put the fans down there to move the CO2, get it back up into the house so it can start rising to reach concentration at the highest level in the house. I'm never concerned about those lowest birds, but the highest concentration is really where I'm concerned about it reaching 40 to 45%. This slide just illustrates it's kind of messy because it was more of a research deal. I had a lot of lines coming out the house just because I was interested in how the CO2 was behaving early on. But really, you just need 2 lines coming out of the house on each end and in the middle. But it shows the technicians then monitoring with the handheld devices, and they take a log about every 5 minutes. They're recording the CO2 and the O2 levels at those different positions. We've reached concentration. The SCBA guys, they're buddied up. They're ready to enter the house and start clearing it for entry. They have personal protective CO2 and O2 monitors that are attached to them, and they also have the handheld devices that they could put down low into a drain or a closet or like a production facility room where they're processing the eggs, and make sure that's cleared before we allow entry. So here's what the venting looks like. Depends on what the humidity level is, but sometimes you can see it. It looks like a vapor. Other times it kind of shimmers and looks like a mirage as it comes out of the house. Keep everyone upwind so that even though it diffuses into the air pretty quickly, we all try to stay upwind when we're venting. So here's a curtain-sided house. This is one of the houses that we gassed in Colorado that was a breeder broiler. We just distributed the manifolds, kind of staggered them at least 25 feet from each other. That's the best practice. We put feed down right after this in the center of the house. All these birds jumped off of these boxes and slats and got in the middle, and then we dropped netting to keep them in the middle of the barn. Here's kind of what the configuration looks like in a flat barn. You can come in from the end like this with 1 tanker, and all you need is 1 tanker, and then just a high and low on each end. If you compress the birds, you just put the high and low at the last point in the house where the birds are. Here's another configuration on a flat barn where we're coming in from a side door. It's equally as effective. You meet concentration and just about exactly the same time. I didn't really find that there's much variation depending on where you set the manifolds in the house. You reach concentration 20% at about 25 minutes, and you reach 45% in 36 to 50 minutes, depending upon the volume of the house. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the turkey barn, there were some challenges. You look at these were fallow barns, and I'm not knocking on the production facilities because they were fallow. They hadn't been used in a year, maybe longer. But the curtains were in disrepair, and we had some challenges keeping the CO2 in the house, and then even greater than that, keeping fresh air from blowing into the house and reviving some of the birds. So we learned a valuable lesson on this house. It was artificially cold. There were high winds that day. We didn't completely seal the house, and even though the birds all went unconscious down when we started venting the house, greater than half of the sentinel birds came back to life. On the subsequent barns we did on the same facility, we sealed the barns more carefully from either poly sheeting on the inside or the outside of the barns, repairing the curtains, putting tape on the curtains. And the lesson learned really, here's the crews doing that on the subsequent houses. The lessons learned is really the farm should be doing all of that curtain side barn repair stuff prior to our crew's arrival, and then all we do is seal the fans into the doors, start gassing the house. I think I covered that, and I guess the main point I'd like to emphasize on this is not only the CO2 concentration is important, but the oxygen level, and then holding it for about 20 minutes at the concentration in the turkey production facilities. So here's what they look like, and the slide on the left is an egg laying facility. The birds become unconscious and are euthanized wherever they are in the cage. Some of them are eating, some of them are in the scratch pad. They're just wherever they are. They're very pliable when we pull them out, and you can see that breeder broiler barn on the right, that they didn't move very far away from the dosing manifolds. Even though it was vapor and it was cold, they sure didn't move very far away from it. They're pliable and relaxed. So I guess I'd like to talk about a little bit about the metrics for the disposals methods in these large egg laying facilities and kind of the methods we've looked at, and it may help some of the operation sections plan for this in the future. So this facility had 105,000 spent hens in it, and we looked at it from what we really asked the producer, hey, what do you think would be the most effective way to remove all these birds within a few hours? And they came up with a metric that will take about 15 people, 2 crews of 15 people, working from the inside of the house to the outside of the house. And they elected to use, you could use other conveyance. They wanted to use their CO2 carts just to drop the birds in, not to gas them with CO2, but just to drop the birds in because they were familiar using them. We built a ramp on one end just with poly and with plywood and a rail. Dumped the birds down the ramp. They went onto a conveyor belt, and then the conveyor belt went. There's the next slide shows the ramp, makeshift. They went on their conveyor belt. The next slide, and then that goes into an conveyance that they took these birds to rendering. Alternatively, on the other end of the house, we had them load directly, just dump the CO2 carts directly into a bucket, and from there you could build compost piles, you could transfer them to a conveyance to take them off site or take them into another building for composting if necessary. So this slide just shows the metrics of an artificial situation in Iowa where the barns were empty, they were cold, there was no manure in the pit, so it took a lot more gas, 74,000 pounds of gas to reach concentration, and look how cold the barn got, -40 down there in the pit. And the Minnesota barn on the right was full production, 105,000 birds. The manure pit wasn't completely full, but it was about a third full, so you didn't have to put CO2 all down in there. We had 2 fans down the pit, kind of moving the CO2 out of there and then recirculating it back up higher. Notice the temperatures, the ambient temperature inside the barn remained 65 to 85 degrees. We used 50,000 pounds instead of 74,000 pounds. So here's some best practices. Depopulation lead, verify the 2-person roll call for accountability. We emphasize the buddy system. Radio communication is paramount. We align line of sight for safety people to be on each corner of the house or each end of the house, looking for ingress and egress in case someone forgets or isn't aware that we're actively gassing those houses. And then we emphasize the entry procedures for SCBA contractors and the safety officer if on site. They consult collectively with the depopulation lead, and the depopulation lead is the only one that will announce that the house is safe to enter to start removing the equipment and or the birds. kind of best practices for setup is to keep the entire 3D contractor crew or whoever you have helping set up together. The biggest amount of manpower, people power is needed to get those units and hoses inside the house. So the crew all stays together till all the units are inside the house. And then we divide into smaller groups to actually put the units together, connect the hoses, start sealing, start placing the monitoring hoses going to the outside of the house. I guess the only thing I'll mention about how deep you can go in the house is about 200 feet. So that's 4 sections of hoses. What happens if you go deeper than that, you can lose pressure within the hose, too much friction within the hose, and it could lead to freezing of the hose and or the dosing manifold. So the shorter the better, and really, I mean, I keep that to a pretty practical level because I found that it really doesn't matter how deep inside the house you set the dosing manifolds, you reach concentration within minutes of whatever variations we've come up with. So it's more like we position them to decrease flash freezing or cold concentrations in certain places or for animal welfare reasons, not necessarily to get deeper inside the house. Best practices for a large egg laying facility for placing CO2 monitors high and low on each end, in the middle of the house as well, and then if there's any kind of processing rooms or adjacent houses or walkways, it's good to have a monitoring line in there so you know what you're getting into as far as clearing that house. On flat barn, just high and low on each end of the house or each end of where the birds are compressed to is sufficient. You know, we try to place them 25 feet away from the monitoring devices, in both situations at least 25 feet away from the dosing manifolds. Best practice for sealing, we found these pallet bands, that we pre-cut the poly to cover all the fans and then just walk through with a crew of 2 or 3 and able to quickly put these bands on no matter what the weather conditions are, and they're very easy to remove as well. Another best practice is signage, safety in multiple languages, and then best practices for sealing the roll-up doors is the insulation batting. The best practice for sealing and venting. So we seal all the fans in these large places except for the fans that are being actively used to vent the house while we're still sealing it. Those are identified with some kind of tape, marking, but it also identifies them for venting because we turn on those. Those are the ones we pull off first to actively start venting the house because you don't need to turn on all the fans to vent the house. Only 3 or 4 fans on each side is needed. Now the best practice I mentioned early on that inlet up in the ceiling of these large production houses, we leave those about a halfway position to allow that displaced air as the CO2 starts filling the house to start escaping. If we don't do that, we found that CO2 starts trying to find its way out of the house either by going in or out the doors, pushing on the polyplastic, and we don't want anything like that to happen, to lose the CO2 or to damage the infrastructure. So you have to have a place to allow that air to escape it as it's being displaced. So what are the costs? I get some questions about this. It's really relative to stocking density. The higher the density, the lower the cost. The CO2 price varies with the time of the year and the location, how far you are from the refill station or production site. We haven't had any costs due to damage to the infrastructure to date. I know with other methods we have had that issue. The birds are very easy to remove. They're pliable. They're not falling apart, so it's not damage to the cages. It's fast and decreases virus shedding and decreases the number of days that the house is down. So there's some cost savings in that. And then the decreased stress on the responders and or producer and exposure to the virus. So I think there's some benefit. And then it allows easy movement for disposal options because you don't really have Birds are pliable. There's no added water. It's easy to put them to a conveyance or move them into windrows to begin composting. The resources are comparable. Just basically flat barn. The take-home message really only takes one tanker, and you can do multiple houses with a tanker. In an egg-laying facility, you got to have 2 tankers, 2 units, and you lose a lot more CO2. You can really do maybe 1, 1.5, perhaps maybe 2 if the houses are pretty small, with 2 tankers in an egg-laying facility. I'll show you a little bit more metrics later on. I tried to do a cost estimate per bird in an egg layer. These weren't the highest stocking densities, but in the Minnesota house that I did, 105,000 birds, it was about 50 cents a bird if I just did one house. But if I had done 2 houses with the same 2 houses up there that same day, it would have been about half that, or 26 cents a bird. For the flat barn cost estimate, I looked at the stocking densities in those breeder boiler houses. They're pretty expensive because the birds weren't densely stocked. It was about $387 per bird if I was just doing one house. But if I was doing 4 houses with that one tanker, it dropped the price down to about 96 cents a bird. So, what's better, foaming or whole house CO2? Well, for floor birds, we have a lot of experience with foam. The capability is getting there. I think particularly in chickens, if you can drive them, and or turkeys, if you can drive them, foaming is really the way to go. Class A foam is pretty cheap. We have experience, we have capabilities. NVS has worked really hard to get some mitigation for cold weather application of that, but there are some other costs. And, I guess, what if you can't move the birds because they're too sick or they're too densely stocked? So there may still be an application for whole house gassing in flat barns. There is metrics known for using carts in egg-laying facilities, but it takes days to weeks depending upon how many carts and crews you have. There's other costs to consider with that, so like exposure and time, virus shedding. Ventilation shutdown, there's costs with that. They're kind of unknown because we haven't done that enough to really have solid metrics, but, how much is it going to cost to add ancillary heat? What about the cleanup time in these decomposed birds? How about the time to depopulate or the animal welfare costs with that and the publicity that we have to deal with that? So those are real costs. And then liquid CO2, lastly, has not been negotiated in bulk. I've only bought it for, 1 tanker, 2 tanker, 4 tankers. If we were purchasing 40 tankers over a period of, a week and a half, the cost should go down with just the volume. Metrics of egg laying facility takes about 4 hours to set up gassing and venting. 50 to 60,000 pounds of liquid CO2 per house. Takes about 7 hours to remove the birds with a large crew. The metrics for operation sections should be a trained crew could do about 2 barns a day, maybe 3 if they were super efficient. Metrics for flat barn takes about 4 hours for setup, gassing, venting. 7 to 12,000 pounds of liquid CO2 is needed. 2 hours for removal of the birds. Trained crews could do 4 to 6 barns per day. So the overview on the next slide is basically in the last training test in Missouri, I had the opportunity to train 16 depopulation leads for veterinary services. Each district, each SPURS district, has trained depopulation leads that could lead or be part of a management team to lead a depopulation using these assets. The pros, it's clean, it's quick, humane, equipment's very simple, it's not affected by cold temperatures outside the house, the procedure is very simple, you can compost on-site or transport off-site, and CO2 is an accepted method of depopulation by the poultry industry. It also meets AVMA performance standards for conditional method of euthanasia of poultry provided conditions are met by the person or company responsible. Cons, there's always cons. House prep, as I said, they don't have to be airtight, but we can't have that fresh oxygen coming in there, or if CO2 is escaping, it's inefficient and a waste of a resource. Availability of CO2 and the distance to production or refill site is a concern. It's also a confined space, so we need SCBA to clear those houses safely. At least right now, until we get some more experience with that, that's the best practice and safety first. It is a high-pressure connection from the tanker to the distribution box, and it requires a CO2 provider to agree to connect. Praxair has had the most experience with that. AirGap has seen it, and I'm working with both companies to agree to, regardless of who the CO2 provider is, they would connect to our pressure-tested units. I guess I want to mention that because you could fabricate these units because they're not that complex in a shop off-site in someone's farm or backyard, but it's important to have them pressure tested for a safety perspective because we got large crews of people moving in and out around these units, and the fabrication has to meet the specs for safety. Another take-home point, the company and the local responder should initiate that sealing of the houses and the background on what we're going to do prior to the NVS assets arriving and the depopulation re-arriving. When we get there, or the assets get there, sealing of the barn sides with poly sheeting should already be completed and, if needed, in curtain-sided barns. Or some of the draining of the water, loosening of the belts, those type things in the egg laying facilities. And then last point I'd like to make, even though we're reaching that CO2 concentration of 40 to 45 minutes and holding it for 10 to 20 minutes, 40 to 45% CO2, holding it for 10 to 20 minutes, monitoring that oxygen concentration to single digits is just as important to ensure complete euthanasia in the barns. Next steps, where are we now? We need to train some more depopulation leads. They've had a good exposure. Some of them are really good at it. Some of them need a little bit more training, but we need more tests, more experience with it, and then also training more 3D contractors. Fabrication and dispersal of more whole house gassing units. That could either be by the NVS stockpile or state animal health authorities and or companies. Socialization to the industry in cooperation with the CO2 providers. We're still working on all of those issues. Quick comment, ducks and geese, the oxygen level has to get down to 5%. So no standard protocol. I've never done this on ducks and geese, and right now I don't think it would be the best method. Here's the contact with Praxair for fabrication. If anyone is interested, Mark Gerke with Praxair Services. He's come to most of our tests and trainings and has proven to be a valuable asset and easy to work with. So he's a cooperator. I'd like to thank all of these people for providing some photographs, some advice, and some metrics. Thank you. And I guess with that, I'll open it back up to questions.
Yes, and we have quite a few questions here that are written, so let's go through those first. The first one is, can the method be used and the houses be vented safely where the farm has other barns, such as swine, dairy, etc., or human habitations close, like within 50 feet to the gassed barn?
Well, I'm going to say yes, but with qualification. We do like to stay upwind from the barn, and when we're approaching a complex, we start with the most downwind house. If there was human habitation in a barn that was, in a house that was within 50 feet of a barn, I think it would be prudent to have that house evacuated prior to. That doesn't seem reasonable to allow people to be in there. They should be upwind as well. Swine, cattle, we have had the situations where we were venting the barns and cattle were in pastures directly behind the barns. I mean, it goes into the atmosphere very quickly. I do think there's consideration when there are buildings that are connected more than just adjacent to. So buildings that are connected through walkways, conveyor belts, or any kind of ventilation ducts and or drains. So if there is commonality with that, some extra consideration needs to be thought about that. So I would say yes, but we'll qualify that, and it would probably have to be site by site, would have to be evaluated.
Okay, the next question is, where are the checklists posted, especially the pre-visit day before key information for local responders?
I've given those to all the depopulation leads. My goal is to get those checklists in each of the units, the trailers that have all the units, so that the checklists and the monitoring sheets are in there in a packet along with the SOP, so that it's a reference packet for anyone that's deploying those assets, and it just goes with the units.
Okay. Is it beneficial?
I'll answer that too. If someone wants a copy of that, send me an email, and I can send them those precast checklists.
Okay. Is it beneficial to use heat with the CO2 to assist with the poultry euthanasia?
No. I will say this, that heat's not really needed inside the house as long as there's birds in there. In heat, the warmer the house is, though, the more efficient the phase change from liquid CO2 to vapor. To vapor, it's liquid and it's in the tanker, and it goes through our system. It becomes vaporized. That phase change is exacerbated and facilitated by heat inside the house. And so it's not necessary in an artificial situation like a cold house, a fallow house. If you were doing a test with it and it was, 30 degrees inside the house, adding heat to the house to simulate a production temperature would be beneficial to facilitate the phase change, but in an actual production house, that's not necessary.
Okay. The next one is, as these units have been distributed around to poultry-dense areas, how frequently are they tested and contact crews exercised?
Well, that would be in development. They've just, in the past several months, just been deployed to the different poultry-dense areas. And just like where the NVS is working to train the 3D contractors on the foaming procedures, I would envision that the same type maintenance and training procedures are done for the whole house gassing.
Okay. So the next question is, do most poultry houses have roof ventilation to ventilate the displaced air as the CO2 is injected, or may it be necessary to create a roof vent?
No, they have ventilation in one type or another. They may not look exactly like the picture that I showed, but they have some kind of ventilation.
Okay. This is a long one. Did you experience any freezing of the lines as you deployed this method? Some egg farms have multiple species on site. Would you feel we could use this method in this type of farm? Using your equation, I see some farms needing more than 100 tons on site. Venting may pose a hazard to other livestock and neighbors in some larger complexes.
Okay, I'll try to break it down and try to remember. But so the first question is more freezing of lines. So I haven't really experienced freezing of the dosing lines or freezing of the distribution box. I think one of the lessons learned we did see a lot of dry ice formation and perhaps decrease in performance of the dosing manifolds when we had them placed too closely to each other. And so that's the recommendation, is to have each of the dosing manifolds placed at least 25 feet from another dosing manifold to prevent that collective cold sink from happening. The more yeah, the warmer the house is, and it's incredible how warm these houses get and how quickly they get as soon as you seal them up. And so, you know, they become, no matter what the temperature is outside, you know, they start gaining in temperature as soon as you stop that active ventilation. Yes, I think, and the other question was, so I haven't really experienced that, but that's a mitigation. Don't place the dosing manifolds too close to each other. Don't make the lines longer than 200 feet. I prefer to keep the line somewhere between 50 and 150 feet because the longer the line is, the more friction, decreased drop in pressure, and the decreased drop in pressure causes the freezing in the lines. Off to the next question. Some of those really large complexes, I think we would have to approach it very carefully in consideration depending upon wind direction, what other species they were, how close they were to the barns. You know, all of those should be considerations, and perhaps maybe if the wind direction was wrong, you know, on one day we wouldn't, you know, vent barns that might, you know, we wouldn't do those barns if it would place another species or production facility in some kind of jeopardy. But it goes into the atmosphere very quickly. It's not like it just blows directly. You know, it diffuses very quickly once you start venting a house into the atmosphere.
Okay, the next question is, would a check-in, check-out card system be beneficial to ensure complete accountability work in this scenario?
Sure. I think a check-in, check-out at least, and we do have that now on checking in and checking out on the farms, at least for our employees or the people that we have control under, not necessarily the farm production people. But yes, I do think that would help. I don't think it should replace the clearing of the house, the roll call with the two-person verification and the communication, line of sight, all of those other safety procedures, but definitely knowing who's on the farm and when, and if they're aware of what we're doing, would definitely be an added safety component.
Next question is it correct that the crew from the 3D contractors handle gassing only, not sealing and not removal of the carcasses? That is done by local responders?
It would be true that the 3D contractors do not do disposal. Those 3D contractors do not remove the birds. The 3D contractors that would be deployed to the house could seal the outside of the house, the curtains, and adjacent to the ends, the barn doors, and the fans. But for the most efficient use of time and the higher skill, it would be beneficial if the local responders and the production facility employees start sealing those barns and dealing some of those mitigation pre-gassing checklist issues so that when the crews get there, they can get right to gassing instead of having to work on, you know, just tacking poly along the side of barns that have damaged curtains. But it is true they don't do disposal. It's not the same crew that does disposal. The 3D gassing contractors and depopulation lead, they focus on depopulation, not disposal.
Another question is, any word on adapting the equipment for the swine depop CO2 reefer trailer prototype?
None other than just thinking about it and kind of scratching some things out. I started doing some initial research and looking at what's been done previously in North Carolina and within the swine industry. They've done a lot of work on creating containerized CO2 type depopulation plans, and they have actually metrics and a lot of information about creating this containerized situation with supplies that you can get from the local hardware store. So all that we've done, or I've done at this point, is just started thinking about how we might be able to retrofit trailers to work in certain situations, but it's more just theory at this point. There's not any hard and fast plans or funding at this time. But I'd be happy to speak to whoever that was to see what their ideas are and how to further facilitate it, because I think it needs to be explored.
Okay. Any idea of potential for virus dispersal occurring with venting of CO2 after the procedure?
Certainly have not done any experiments with that, but anecdotally, I didn't observe that when I saw the Canadians utilize it in the Fraser River Valley, and they had really high concentration, density. You know, you could see poultry houses, you know, wherever they have poultry houses, you just walk outside and, you know, within 200 to 400 yards, you can see another poultry house. I think the bigger risk is movement between the farms of people and equipment, and not necessarily the venting of the house for CO2. I do think that maybe some research could be done to maybe prove that it's not. It may be one of those situations where in certain weather conditions, when the wind's blowing really hard, maybe you don't do it till the wind dies down, so that there's not as much dispersal. But isn't there dispersal of the virus all the time anyway in infected houses? So I don't know why that would be greater when you're just venting the house with CO2 in it, because that house has already been maybe shedding some virus out through the ventilation system up to that point. And we don't turn on all the fans, only a few fans are necessary to vent the house. But I think I'd qualify my deal that I'm not too concerned about that as being a major way of spread, but I think maybe some work should be done on that to prove that it's not a risk factor.
And the last written question we have is, wouldn't you see birds dying as soon as you turned off ventilation while you were sealing the building prior to turning on the CO2? We haven't experienced that because it doesn't get hot quite that quickly, and it doesn't. I mean, we still keep it ventilated until it gets to that last deal where we're sealing the last 2 or 4 fans and sealing that last indoor. So, you know, we're very careful to remain the animal welfare consideration of that, and we've monitored the temperatures in these houses, and they haven't spiked up, you know, into the hundreds high enough to kill the birds, you know, in a mass situation. So I would say no, but perhaps in some circumstances there could be some of that where it begins with ventilation shutdown and it ends with whole house CO2. I can see that. It's not a deal, but it doesn't stay that way for very long. Once that CO2 starts coming into the house, those temperatures are going to equalize, or not equalize, but start coming back down again. I think the highest temperature I remember seeing in a house was, and it was a pretty warm day up in Minnesota, it was approaching 100, 98. I think was the highest I saw in the house just for a couple of minutes, you know, before the CO2 started reaching, you know, some concentration flow. And it looks like, Scott, we also have someone that has a verbal question.
Sure.
Absolutely. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted now.
Hi. After hearing about you discussing the collaboration with obviously other USDA personnel and contractors, you mentioned there's approximately 16 trained leads that would be in various districts. What kind of collaboration have you had at the state level? Are there people at each state that you are trained enough that they could lead on some portion of this in the state as well, with more of the fact that we'd be assisting? Or is this a case that we would anticipate that if this needed to come down to it, we would be stepping in completely?
At this time, great question. At this time, I've only tried to actively train veterinary services depopulation leads that are employed by USDA Veterinary Services, because they are USDA assets, and there's a certain amount of accountability at this point. Now, that doesn't mean that if a state animal health authority wants to purchase one of these units that we wouldn't work with them, share our protocols, help train them, and or a poultry industry want to do the same thing. And I've had both type groups approach me about it. But at this time, I think accountability of using this procedure, we need to stick with having the USDA trained depopulation lead being the primary one in charge of the depopulation and utilizing these assets. That doesn't mean the State Animal Health Authority depopulation lead couldn't work along with and help facilitate the process, but at this time, I think we need to stick with the USDA depopulation leads as being the ones in charge at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any additional questions?
As of now, we don't have any more raised hand or any more written questions which have come in.
Okay. Well, if you do have questions, you know you can always get a hold of Scott or myself, and we can get you the answers that you need. I just wanted to let everybody know that's still on the line that we do have another webinar coming up on October 26th, and I'm going to be discussing continuing education options for our foreign animal disease diagnosticians. We also have an overview of the dairy industry on November 2nd, and the last one in November is the Secure Food Supply Business Continuity Plan on November 14th, and I will be sending out information regarding connection to all these webinars. So if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank everyone, and I'd like to thank you, Scott, for a really interesting webinar today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for your opportunity and everyone's attention, and I'm open to helping develop this system to be more universal and more socialized. So thanks for the opportunity, Liz, and thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.